Well, greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome to the John Campea Podcast. My name, of course, is John Campea, and thank you for visiting my YouTube channel. This is the podcast for Monday, August the 14th. Got a few things in the world of movie news to go over, and then, of course, we're going to take the questions that you guys send in, talking about all things movies and entertainment. So let's get started. One of the best actors in the world, as well as being one of the most active producers in Hollywood right now, Leonardo DiCaprio and Paramount Pictures have won the rights to the new novel Leonardo Da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. Now, even though the book by Walter Isaacson doesn't come out for a couple of months, there's already been a big bidding war that Paramount was involved. Apparently, their chief competitor in this bidding war was Universal. Paramount won out, now they get to make the movie. Now, for a book that hasn't even come out yet, why are they fighting over this? Well, because it's a biography by Walter Isaacson. You see, Walter Isaacson also wrote Steve Jobs, which was the basis for that Michael Fassbender movie in 2015. Now, Isaacson has also written other biographies of Benjamin Franklin, Henry Kissinger, and Albert Einstein, which was the basis for that new show Geniuses on TV. The guy clearly knows what he's doing when it comes to writing this stuff. Now, just because the book is going to be great, that doesn't necessarily mean the movie's going to be any great. Like, we've seen that happen 1,000 times in Hollywood. Great novel, not so good movie. That absolutely happens. It could happen here. But I like what Paramount is doing with this. I love the idea of doing a film just on Da Vinci. I think that's a very cool move. And getting a producer like Leonardo DiCaprio on board is great, and probably acting in it as well, which will probably also act as the big flare in the air that we got DiCaprio, after waiting so long for his first Academy Award, might actually be making his push for his second one. Next up, you've probably heard me talk about this film for a while now, but the upcoming Jackie Chan and Pierce Brosnan film, The Foreigner, is rapidly approaching. That's great. It's a movie that was barely on my radar until the trailers dropped, and I'm like, oh my God, like, this looks awesome. And I don't know that Jackie Chan has ever looked better in a trailer. I've ever been more intrigued to see a Jackie Chan movie as I am about this one. It looks amazing. There's something about a father's righteous vengeance that makes for stories I love hearing. You add into that mix Pierce Brosnan, who does not appear in nearly as many movies as this dude totally should, and I'm completely on board for it. For those of you who don't know anything about The Foreigner, the basic story, as far as I can gather, is this. So Jackie Chan is just a average guy, at least on the surface. He's just a humble man leading a humble life, and all he's got in the world is his daughter, and he loves his daughter, and his daughter becomes an innocent victim in a domestic terrorism attack, and his daughter dies. Jackie Chan goes crazy, and he starts hunting down and looking for the people who might be responsible. His search eventually leads to this government official played by Pierce Brosnan. Now, he doesn't think Pierce Brosnan did it, but he thinks Pierce Brosnan knows who did it and isn't telling him. It's at that point that you realize that Jackie Chan isn't just some normal, humble guy. He's like massive military warrior dude who decides he's going to go to war against some people, and you don't want Jackie Chan going to war against you, of course. And now it becomes this game of cat and mouse and survival between Jackie Chan and Pierce Brosnan, and the movie looks amazing. Anyway, these two new posters, this is the point of the story, is two new posters dropped. And I love these posters because you're seeing in these posters the duality of both characters. Like, you got the Jackie Chan one, which is awesome, and you got the Pierce Brosnan one, which makes him look fierce as hell at the same time. I'm telling you, I cannot wait for this movie to come out. I'm actually super excited about it. So keep your eyes open, definitely, for the upcoming movie, The Foreigner. Should also take a minute to talk about this. Like, one of the most impressive things about Tom Cruise, and let's say there's a lot of impressive things about the dude, but one of the most impressive things about him recently is he loves doing his own stunts where possible. Of course, we saw that in like the last Mission Impossible movie, where he literally strapped himself on the outside of a jet plane taking off. That wasn't special effects. That was actually him doing it. And he likes doing these crazy things. Anyway, they're off filming the newest Mission Impossible movie at the minute. And there is this new stunt where he needed to run and literally jump from one building to another. And he's supposed to slam into the side of the building that he's jumping to, except, you know, save himself with his hands and then pull himself up on the building. Well, video emerged of Tom Cruise pulling off this stunt, and he slams into the wall, sure, just like he was supposed to, climbs up on the roof and starts to run, but then you notice he limps pretty hard. And then after they yelled cut, he's limping pretty hard, and it looks like he might have injured himself. Now, nobody's saying how extensive the injury is. Did he break his leg? Did he just bruise his thigh? Did he just have to shake it off? Nobody's really talking about that. I think, though, this just highlights that Tom Cruise, at 55, is still pulling off these stunts on his own. He's putting that type of work and that type of dedication into his movies. Now, love or hate Tom Cruise's movies, the one thing that I think an incident like this points out is never doubt his commitment to the movies that he's making. And last thing before we get to the viewer emails, of course, Sony has announced that they have moved the release date of their upcoming Spider-Universe characters film, Silver and Black. Now, of course, this is going to be based on the characters Silver Sable and Black Cat. They are going to get their own movie. We've known that for a while. Now, originally, the film was supposed to come out in October of next year, October 2018, which was kind of close and also pretty close to the Venom movie that Tom Hardy's playing in. I thought that was always a little bit odd. Anyway, they've just announced that they've moved it to February 8th, 2019. What is also interesting about that February 8th, 2019 date is right now that is the scheduled release date for the Lego Movie 2. I do not think either studio wants to see the Lego Movie 2 and Silver and Black open on the same day. You're going for a lot of the same demographic there. At the same time, I don't think those films are going to want to go to head to head. I expect one of them will move again, but for now, Silver and Black's release date is February 8th, 2019. All right, now with that stuff out of the way, let's get into the viewer questions that you guys have sent in to me. How do you get an email on the John Campea Podcast? It's simple. Just email me anytime at thejohncampeapodcast@gmail.com. That's thejohncampeapodcast@gmail.com. Send on in your questions. I pick a few out every day. So let's dive into it. The first question comes to us today from Jeremy Ingalls, who writes, "Hey John, I've been a big fan since AMC. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I just saw Man of Steel for the first time because of your top 10 comic book movies video, and I loved it." That's awesome to hear. I love people who are checking out these movies that I talk about. "And I saw that Christopher Nolan was a producer. He was also a producer for Batman vs. Superman. How much involvement did he actually have in these films? Do you think he will have any involvement in the upcoming DC movies?" Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, that's a question that people were asking a lot, especially around the time when Man of Steel was coming out, because they added Christopher Nolan's name as a producer. But here's the reality of it. Christopher Nolan, I think they gave him a check just so they could be allowed to put Christopher Nolan's name on as a producer. I don't think he had very much involvement in either of those movies at all. I think he probably had some consulting. He gave them some ideas, or he let them throw some ideas by him, and he just told them his opinions. But anyway, Henry Cavill, the guy who plays Superman, was asked about how much involvement Christopher Nolan had once before in an interview, and this is what Henry Cavill had to say. "Chris Nolan wasn't there during the production itself, although I'm not sure how much work was done behind the scenes. I'm sure Zach had a phone call or two with him, but this is definitely Zach's baby. He was the man in charge, and we created the character together as opposed to having too many outside influences." So at least from the star of the movie of Man of Steel, from his perspective, Christopher Nolan was barely involved. Like I said, him and Zack Snyder probably had a couple of conversations, but he wasn't that involved. And then you never saw Christopher Nolan anywhere near the Batman vs. Superman set. So that's neither a good nor a bad thing that Christopher Nolan wasn't involved. That's either here nor there. You can have your own opinion about that. But the fact of the matter is he really didn't have much involvement. And I don't expect that he'll have probably any involvement whatsoever in the DCEU moving forward. Now, they may give him a check to put his name on as a producer, and lots of movies do that, but I really don't think you'll see any practical involvement from Christopher Nolan. All right, and now we move on to the next question, and this question comes to us from Stifler's dad. And Stifler's dad writes, "I know that you always say that adapted characters do not have to be visually the same as they are in their source. However, what about their personality? For example, you always say that Stephen Amell is great as Green Arrow. However, his character is nothing like it is in the comic books or animated shows. The original one is fun and sarcastic and quirky. Amell's Arrow can't smile to save his life." Thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, this is a topic that comes up a lot, especially amongst comic book movie fans or comic book TV shows or comic book fans in general, is how similar and how much liberty and creative freedom do filmmakers and television showrunners take with the comic book characters. Now, it's definitely true that Stephen Amell's Arrow, his Oliver Queen, is vastly different than some, comic book iterations of Oliver Queen. Absolutely. But I'm reminded this one time that Bryan Singer, this was before Superman Returns came out. Bryan Singer went to Comic-Con and he was asked the question, "What made you decide to change the Superman costume?" And Bryan Singer said back to them, he said, "Change it from what?" And the person asked the question is, "Well, you changed it from the comic book." And Bryan Singer said the greatest answer that I think a lot of people have to keep in mind. He goes, But which comic book Superman costume? There have been 24 variations of the Superman costume in the comic books. So when you ask me, why did I change it from the comic? I want to ask you, change it from which version? Because there have been tons of versions. Some versions massively different from the other, whether you're talking about the traditional Superman suit and then the all black with silver lettering. But even beyond that, there have been like tons of tiny variations on the Superman suit throughout the years. So he says, when you ask me, why did I change the suit? I'm going to ask you, change it from which suit? Like if I were to ask you in the comic books, is Nick Fury white or black? The answer is yes. In the comic books, he's been white, and in the comic books, he's been black. And so with Oliver Queen in the comics as well, is he often seen as this jovial kind of jokester kind of a dude? Yeah, in many ways. But then you look at a graphic novel like The Dark Knight Returns, and he's a miserable old sod. I guess for me, the main thing comes down to this. I say this all the time, but it really is applicable to this question here. The first responsibility of a filmmaker, or in this case, people making a TV show, the first responsibility is don't be as true to the comic as possible. That's not their first responsibility. Be as true to the comic as possible is not the goal. The goal is to make the best movie possible, or in this case, to make the best television show possible. And if they feel that taking creative liberties with certain aspects of the look or character of this, this character that's in the comic books, then that's what they need to do. And I'll be honest with you. The first 2 seasons of Arrow, I think it worked perfectly. They decided to take the Oliver Queen character, change a lot of his core stuff, but they basically still kept who he was. He's Oliver Queen and how he came about and all that kind of stuff. But they decided to make him, since they're not allowed to use Batman in the CW world, they decided, well, then Oliver Queen, Green Arrow, is going to be our Batman, our human character with no powers, rich playboy, but he's also kind of feared and respected by other heroes with superpowers. I mean, they kind of made him that way, and they played it. Now, some people criticize them for doing that. I actually thought that was really the right move for it, and I thought it made for a pretty damn good show until the show came off the rails in season 3, but I won't go into that. So they made the decision that they thought would make for the best TV show. Remember, what makes for a great story in the comic books does not necessarily mean it'll work great on screen, and in this case, they felt that the Oliver Queen character needed to be a certain way, and they took that creative liberty. And look, the show's going into season 6, so clearly the decision has worked for them, and they've had some success with it, and I don't expect them to change that. So yeah, keep things the same when you can. Change things where you need to when needed. It's a real simple philosophy, and I think the Arrow example is just a great example of that. All right, now we move on to the third question, and the third question today comes to us from Lucas Wentz, who writes, my question is about how movies release digitally a couple of weeks before they do on Blu-ray. This has always seemed unfair to me. Why do I have to wait 2 weeks longer to get my copy of a movie that I'm eagerly anticipating coming out? Is it just a way to encourage more people to go digital? What do you think of this trend? Thanks a lot for the question, Lucas. And yeah, you're not wrong. That is a trend in the industry. It's the norm now, actually, is that when a movie is coming out, let's say, Wonder Woman is coming out on home video, it will come out on digital streaming before the Blu-ray comes out. That is the new kind of norm, the way they like to do it. Now, let me address a couple things. Number one, your last question was this a way for them to try to encourage people to go digital? I believe yes. I believe when they're getting streaming going, it's a new revenue stream. Blu-ray sales were starting to sag and drop. So what they decided to do was to encourage people to go digital, and they put them out on digital first. Great. Also remember, it's ready to go out on digital. I'm not saying this is a big reason, but movies are ready to go out on digital before they are on Blu-ray because they got the movie. All they got to do is put it on a server and boom. With Blu-rays, you got to produce the packaging. You got to ship them to vendors around the world, get the sales things ready. And it's much more time consuming to sell a physical product like a Blu-ray disc. And a lot more work has to go into and a lot more preparation than just saying, okay, we've got the movie ready. Oh, let's just put the file on a streaming service and we'll make it available for streaming. It's ready to go faster than a Blu-ray is ready to go. So there's that. And yes, they want to encourage people going, and they know physical medium is a doomed product. I mean, Blu-rays aren't going to be around 10 years from now. They're just not. Everything's going to be streaming and digital and all that kind of stuff eventually. So they're just trying to encourage people to move over now. Now, as far as your other thing goes about, it doesn't seem fair that you have to wait 2 weeks longer. But here's the thing. In saying it's not fair that you have to wait longer, that's implying that you would have got your Blu-ray 2 weeks earlier if it wasn't for streaming. And that's not the case. Let's say, for example, that Wonder Woman, I can't remember the actual release date, so I'm just going to make up a number, okay? So let's say Wonder Woman was coming out digitally on, I don't know, October 1st, okay? And then let's say the Blu-ray was coming out on October 14th. Now, you would be tempted to say, why do I have to wait 2 extra weeks on October 14th to get my Blu-ray copy when they're getting it then? But you're assuming that if there was no digital streaming that you would have got it on August 1st. The reality is you probably still would have got your Blu-ray. If there was no such thing as streaming and they weren't streaming movies, you still probably would have gotten your Blu-ray on October 14th. That's when you probably still would have got it anyway. So to say, why do I need to wait 2 weeks longer? The real answer to that is probably you're not waiting any longer. It just so happens that they're going to put this version up earlier than they had planned anyway. So it's not that you have to wait longer. You have to wait as long as you were going to wait, whether or not they had streaming. So then streaming became available. They've decided to put it up early. So there you go. It reminds me a lot of the whole Comic-Con situation. It's like when they show exclusive footage at Comic-Con and people around the world go, it's not fair. How come I don't get to watch that trailer because they got to watch it? That's not fair. And the reason I reject that kind of thinking is because, look, they made that footage exclusively for Comic-Con. If they were going to make a trailer and give it to you at the same time that Comic-Con was going to be going on, and then they decided to keep it from you, well, then you're being ripped off. But the fact of the matter is, even if they weren't showing that footage at Comic-Con, you weren't going to see it anyway, because they specifically put that footage together to show to the crowd at Comic-Con. And if the crowd at Comic-Con wasn't there, they just wouldn't have made it in the first place. So you see, what happens is we sometimes act as if the only reason I don't get to see this footage is because they're only showing it to them at Comic-Con. And it's like, I've been trying to get this through people's heads. No, it's not. That's not the reason you're not getting the footage. Because if those people weren't at Comic-Con and Comic-Con didn't exist, they wouldn't have made that piece of footage in the first place to show anybody. So you still wouldn't have seen it. You still wouldn't have seen it. So it's not an issue of fairness, and they get to watch it and I don't. So what it ultimately comes down to is this. Well, then if I don't get to have it, nobody should get to have it. And that's a really ridiculous, immature way to think. That if I don't get to have it, nobody should have it. That's a ridiculous way of thinking. And I reject that way of thinking. So yeah, I just think people need to wrap their heads around that sometimes things are made for one thing. And if that one thing wasn't there, they weren't going to make it in the first place. So you still wouldn't have had it. So no, you're not missing out on anything. That's just the way it is. Anyway, with the streaming and Blu-ray thing, yeah, again, I think they're doing it because they want to encourage people to go over to the streaming services. But number two, they're not making you wait longer because that's how long you would have had to have waited anyway, even if there was no such thing as streaming. And look, maybe you have a different opinion on that. And that's totally cool. That's great. I know there's a lot of people out there that love the Blu-ray medium. They love buying Blu-rays and have big Blu-ray collections, and that's awesome. I celebrate that with you. That's just, though, the way that I kind of see things going. All right, and we move on to the next question. The next question today comes to us from Johnny Tutor, who writes, my greatest cinema wish is for Lucasfilm/Disney to reboot the Star Wars prequels to remove the stench that still permeates the Star Wars universe from these piles of crap. Since neither of these wishes will ever happen in my lifetime, I have thought of an alternative way to somewhat cleanse the prequel stink from our nostrils. What would you think about the possibility of Lucasfilm/Disney allowing Timothy Zahn and or Claudia Gray to reboot the Star Wars prequels in novel form? Well, thanks a lot for the question, Johnny. For those of you who don't know, Timothy Zahn is the guy who wrote like the Heir to the Empire series, the Thrawn trilogy. Claudia Gray wrote the magnificent Star Wars novel, Lost Stars, and I believe she also did Bloodline with the Princess Leia based kind of story. And she's done a terrific job as well. So what he's asking is, hey, can we retcon and get rid of the prequels by having these novelists kind of redo the prequels in novel form? Now, you guys all know I am somebody who does not like the prequels at all. I think they're terrible films. I'm not telling anybody else not to like them. If you like them, aces. That's great. I'm celebrate with you that you like them. That's awesome. I'm not trying to talk you out of liking them. But for me, I think they're terrible. So let me answer that question as somebody who thinks the prequels are terrible. No, you cannot touch the prequels. Why? Because they're canon. Am I happy that they're canon? No, but they are canon, and that means something. They are officially part of the Star Wars lore. You can't touch them. You can't alter them. You can't change them, even if it's just novel form. Because remember, Lucasfilm has now said in this glorious new age, the novels are canon as well. So you can't have one piece of canon screwing around with another piece of canon, okay? I make this analogy a lot, but let me bring it up here again. It's like you've got your family, but every family, no matter how great it is, you got that one stupid pain in the ass Uncle Ted. Let's just call him Uncle Ted for argument's sake, okay? And Uncle Ted is an embarrassment to the family. He's 42 years old. He still lives at your grandmother's house. He still lives with his mom in the basement. He won't get a job. He does way too much weed. Nothing wrong doing weed, but he does way too much weed instead of going out and working. He drinks too much, blah, 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 and he's just an embarrassment to the family. But he's family. He's still Uncle Ted, and you still love him, and he's a part of your fold, and he's a part of your family, and that's the way it is. Do we wish he would change? Yes. Do we wish he would go get a job? Yes. But he's family. And that's how we need to look at the prequels. If you're somebody who doesn't like the prequels, that the prequels may be a terrible stench in our nostrils, as you put them, but they're still family. They're still Star Wars canon. And I can like it or not like it, whatever, but even I will stand up and say, you cannot touch the prequels. They're canon. They're family. I wish they were different. I wish they had made the movies way differently, but it is what it is. They're family, and I won't let you touch them. As a fan, I would say that. I would say I wouldn't even let you touch them if it was my choice. That's how extreme it is. If it was my choice, as somebody who hates the prequels, I would not let you change them whatsoever. And also, let's not forget that while you hate the prequels, and while I hate the prequels, there are passionate Star Wars fans out there who love the prequels. I don't know why, but they do. And it would be tremendously unfair that just because you don't like the prequels and just because I don't like the prequels, that means we should take that away from the fans who do love them. And because there are a bunch of people out there who really honestly enjoy those films. And that's the great thing about movies, is the pure subjectivity of them. And we all get to have different experiences and different opinions about movies. And that's awesome. So yeah, they would not let them change it in novel form because novels are canon and the movies are canon, and you can't have canon contradicting canon. At least that's the goal at any rate. And number two, we shouldn't want to change them because within our family of Star Wars fans, a bunch of our family do like those films, and we shouldn't take that away from them just because we don't like it. So anyway, that's the way I see it. All right, and the final question today comes to us from Jeff Dyer, who writes, why wasn't the Back to the Future trilogy included in your list of best trilogies of all time? I think those films are some of the most cleverly interconnected movies of all time, brilliantly written, acted, and directed. Even Part 2, which is generally the least liked, I thought was amazing and inventive. Just curious why you didn't make your cut. It didn't make your cut or get honorable mention. Now, for those of you who don't know what Jeff's talking about, I recently did a video. I'll put a link to the description in the description below of what I thought were the 5 greatest trilogies of all time. And those trilogies were Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Godfather, Toy Story, and Indiana Jones. And I gave honorable mention to Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight, to Captain America, the Captain America trilogy. And there was another trilogy I gave honorable, the Planet of the Apes trilogy, the new Planet of the Apes trilogy I gave honorable mention to because I thought they should be mentioned. And I gave my reasons about why, like Captain America and Dark Knight didn't make it in, because I thought there was too weak of a link in their trilogy. There was one film that was just too weak of a link to make it into that top one, but whatever. But one of the ones that I did not mention that a lot of people thought I would put in the list was Back to the Future. Why not put in Back to the Future? Because, and this is just my opinion, okay? But it was my list. So this is just my opinion. Back to the Future is one of the great all-time most beloved movies ever. Back to the Future 2 is not, and Back to the Future 3 is not. You hardly ever hear anybody talking about Back to the Future 2 or Back to the Future 3. Neither of those were as good, nearly as good, as Back to the Future 1. If Back to the Future 2 and 3 were even remotely close to being as good as the first one, yes, then there has to be some serious consideration. But one all-time great classic film does not make a trilogy. So if you were to ask me to put together a list of the top 100 best films of all time, Back to the Future would make it onto my list. But if I'm putting together a top 5 trilogies of all time, in my opinion, like again, you expressed in your question that they are to you, and that's wonderful. That's awesome. But for me, Part 2 and Part 3 just aren't strong enough to, even when coupled with the amazing Part 1, to make it one of the great trilogies of all time. It's a trilogy that has an all-time great movie in it, but it's not an all-time great trilogy. Again, that's just my opinion, but that's why I didn't put Back to the Future in my list. But I'm curious, what do you guys think? Would you have put the Back to the Future trilogy in your top 5 greatest trilogies of all time, even though part 2 and 3 aren't nearly as good as the first one, or maybe you'd think they are? I want to know your thoughts. Jump into the comments section and let me know below. Anyway, guys, that'll do it for me for this installment of the John Campea Podcast. Thanks again for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow. Hey, listen, if you're one of the people who likes my 70 to 90 videos a month and you watch me all the time, I encourage you, check out my Patreon page. I'll put a link in the description below, and consider becoming one of my supporters to make sure we can keep doing all these videos. Also, while you're here, make sure you click the subscribe button, become a subscriber to my YouTube channel. That'll do it for me, guys. Thanks so much for joining me, and until next time, bye-bye.